but they will be inserted for the record with unanimous consent. Hearing no objection, that will be accomplished. We're fortunate today in the first hearing of the subcommittee to have three very distinguished witnesses. And in my opinion, at least, the first witness is particularly distinguished. One of the greatest U.S. senators of our era, Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana. We appreciate your being here, but we're also deeply honored to have Ambassador Sandy Withdrawal here, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, and finally, the Honorable Paula de Sutter, former Assistant Secretary of State for Verification, Compliance, and Implementation. Having had a chance to look at their testimony, we should all be grateful. They did such an excellent job preparing and informing this subcommittee. So without further ado, let's hear from the witnesses, starting with Senator Lugar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you and the ranking member for this opportunity. My contribution—
If you could get a little closer to the microphone, that would be great. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. My contribution to the discussion today is based upon analyzing the technical aspects of the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the Inf Treaty than on broader historical lessons that I have learned during 4 years of intensive work on reducing the threat of weapons of mass destruction. I was one of the original co-chairs of the Arms Control Observer Group, put together by President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s to ensure unity of purpose between the executive and legislative branches on arms control. I was a floor manager for every arms control treaty that came before the Senate, from the INF Treaty in 1987 to the New START Treaty in 2010. In conjunction with the non-Lugar program, I've witnessed the safeguarding or dismantling of just about every type of weapon of mass destruction imaginable, from Typhoon submarines and SS-18s to backfire bombers, millions of VX artillery shells, and laboratories housing anthrax and plague. Our relationship with Russia and our mutual interest in constraining the threat from weapons of mass destruction is a long game, not a short one. That being said, there can be no breaks in our determination each day to prevent disaster. I'd like to offer a few principles that should inform deliberations on where we go from here. First, the Russians are in violation of the INF Treaty, but Russian violations are not a new phenomenon. A major feature of every arms control debate since 1987 was discussion of actual or potential Russian violations. Every president has dealt with this. I believe it's easy to expose, counter, and reverse those violations with the INF Treaty than without it. That is, within the treaty than without it. Now, second, arms control is not just about limits on weapons. Much of the value of agreements comes from verification provisions. There is safety in transparency. Our strategic relationship with Russia was never better than when Russia and American technicians were working together on non-Lugar projects to circumscribe the decaying Russian arsenal under provisions of active arms treaties. We knew a lot about each other, and we were talking about it every day. The worst thing we can do is undercut verification procedures that give us a window on Russian activities and capabilities. Third, effective arms control is less about negotiating brilliance than it is about the accumulation of leverage. Withdrawing from the INF Treaty does nothing to bolster our leverage. It foolishly plays into the hands of Russian propagandists by focusing global attention on our rejection of the treaty rather than Russian violations. It complicates relations with allies, and it signals to the Iranians, North Koreans, and others who would pursue a nuclear arsenal that we are devaluing our own historic legacy as the guarantor of legal frameworks designed to prevent nuclear proliferation. Finally, regardless of near-term decisions on the INF Treaty, drifting towards unrestrained arms competition would be an incredibly hazardous outcome. This does not mean the United States cannot modernize elements of its nuclear deterrent, but allowing verification procedures to expire and basing our security on the hope of winning an expensive arms race would be the height of irresponsibility. This isn't 1981. We live in an increasingly multipolar world that features cyber warfare, suicidal terrorism, additional nuclear states, and increased avenues to nuclear proliferation. We also had a sobering budget deficit of $779 billion in 2018. The bottom line is that jettisoning treaties that provide a legal framework for exposing Russian violations achieves nothing. We should be pursuing a consistent strategy that strengthens the Western alliance, makes sensible defense investments, and builds leverage that could put the arms control process back on track. To do that, we need much more consistency of purpose. The successful launching of an era of arms control by Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev and H.W. Bush was achieved largely because presidents rejected, or rather projected, a consistent foreign policy that undergirded international law, stood up to dictators, commanded respect, and united the free world. The United States returning to that posture would be a major setback for Russian oligarchs and would strengthen the United States' ability to press a new strategic dialogue based on mutual interest. I thank the chair.
I thank the senator. Ambassador Virchow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Turner, members of the subcommittee. Thanks very much for the invitation to offer my views on the implications of the imminent demise of the INF Treaty for the future of arms control and strategic stability with Russia. It's an honor to be here with Senator Dick Lugar, who's played such a fantastic and prominent role in preventing nuclear proliferation since the end of the Cold War. And it's also good to be here with my former State Department colleague, Paula de Sutter. The INF Treaty had a transformational impact in ending the Cold War and stabilizing relations between the West and Moscow for more than 3 decades. And it came about thanks to the determination and resolve shown by the United States and its NATO allies when they adopted the dual-track decision in 1979 in response to Soviet deployment of the SS-20 intermediate-range ballistic missile. And it followed 2 years of very intense consultations within NATO, led by the United States. The deployment of U.S. Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles restored the balance in Europe and reinforced the credibility of the U.S. nuclear guarantee, depriving the Soviets of what the nuclear experts call escalation dominance. And the NATO offer of an arms control alternative was, of course, initially rejected by the Soviet Union, which walked out of the talks when the first U.S. missiles went in 1983, hoping to derail those deployments by fomenting popular opposition. But NATO solidarity held, and Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev had the vision not just to limit INF, but to eliminate this entire class of systems. So the dual-track decision was a powerful demonstration of how to negotiate from a position of strength, and it gave impetus to talks to reduce strategic weapons and conventional armed forces in Europe. All that progress is now at risk with the U.S. decision to suspend its implementation of the INF Treaty and withdraw from the treaty, together with Russia's decision to follow suit by suspending its implementation as well. The risk is only heightened by the significant deterioration in the wider relationship between the West and Russia as a result of Putin's aggression against Ukraine and aggression against Western democracy writ large. Today's Russian leaders may be more prepared to use their nuclear weapons coercively than Soviet leaders in the 70s and 80s as part of their strategy to weaken NATO and reestablish domination over Russia's neighbors. Now, the administration's decision to withdraw from the treaty is legally justified, but I believe it was politically questionable. Legally, Russia is clearly in material breach of its obligations, and the administration has a certain logic in arguing that it's difficult to justify continuing to comply with a treaty that the other side is violating. And our NATO allies, having seen the evidence of Russia's violation, have supported the U.S. decision to withdraw as a legal matter, and they haven't bought into Russia's dubious countercharges that it's the United States, not Russia, that has violated the treaty. But our allies are concerned that politically we may have given a gift to President Putin, who has long sought to escape the INF Treaty's limitations so that Russia could counter INF missiles of countries like China and Pakistan, not subject to the treaty's constraints. And it appears, based on the saber-rattling we've heard just last week from President Putin, that Russia is bent on deploying additional INF systems and other new nuclear capabilities as part of his strategy of intimidating NATO and recapturing the escalation dominance that Russia lost when it scrapped the SS-20. And our withdrawal from the treaty will give Russia free rein to rapidly deploy ground-launched versions of its newest cruise missiles and hypersonic weapons, in addition to the illegal 9M729. Now, the U.S. and its allies have kept the door open to a diplomatic solution. They've made clear that if Russia agrees to dismantle its illegal missile, the U.S. could reverse its decision to suspend and withdraw from the treaty. But last-ditch negotiations have been going nowhere, and it now seems inevitable that the treaty will become a dead letter on August 2nd, 6 months after the administration gave its notice to withdraw. In my view, however, we shouldn't give up on other possible arms control solutions that could at least mitigate the effects of the loss of the INF Treaty. So far, it appears that Russia's illegal cruise missile, while capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, has only been deployed as a conventional system. The United States and NATO, for their part, have downplayed any intention to deploy new nuclear-armed missiles in Europe. So one possible solution would be to challenge Russia to agree to a mutual renunciation of all nuclear-armed land-based INF-range missiles, including the 9M729, and to agree to mutual inspections to verify that no nuclear-armed versions are deployed by either side. And as part of this arrangement, the U.S. and its allies could agree to Russian inspections of the U.S. missile defense sites in Romania and Poland to confirm that they have no offensive capability, as Moscow has alleged. The sides could also perhaps agree to numerical limits on the permitted conventionally armed systems. Another solution would be for the United States and Russia to agree to refrain from deploying any land-based INF systems in or within range of Europe, while permitting some agreed number of such systems in Asia. We could even invite China to participate in such an arrangement, as President Trump suggested in his State of the Union address. A successor agreement along the above lines could help maintain stability and avert an unconstrained competition in intermediate range systems, and it could improve the climate for talks on an extension or strengthening of the New START treaty prior to its expiration in 2021, which I would strongly favor. Until we've exhausted the possibilities for a successor to the INF Treaty, we should proceed cautiously on the question of military countermeasures. We should review the options in close consultation with our NATO allies, as we did in the 1970s in preparing the dual-track decision, since the allies are the ones that could literally be caught in the crossfire of any new U.S.-Russian missile competition in Europe. NATO has a lot of work still to be done to strengthen its overall defense and deterrence posture in Europe. Deploying new intermediate-range land-based missiles in Europe is not essential to these efforts and could be politically divisive within the alliance. And in fact, I think there are many existing U.S. programs that could be adapted to negate the military advantage the Russians hope to gain with the 9M729 without developing a new intermediate-range ground-launched cruise missile of our own. And I mentioned these in detail in my prepared statement. We could also deploy additional missile defense systems to protect key military installations against Russian cruise missile threats. Now, I strongly believe NATO's assessment of the options should focus on conventional solutions, but we and our allies should make clear to Moscow that if Russia deploys nuclear-armed INF missiles along NATO's borders, we don't rule out new nuclear-armed systems of our own. We should keep the onus on Moscow, however, for any new arms competition in Europe. One final point, there may be a stronger case for deploying conventionally armed intermediate-range missile systems, both cruise and ballistic, in the Asia-Pacific region than in Europe. They could counter China's significant INF capabilities and its threat to U.S. bases in Japan and Korea. Having said this, it remains to be seen if our allies, the Japanese and the Koreans, would agree to host these systems once they were developed, or whether it would be more realistic to continue to rely on air and sea launch systems for these missions. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. DeSutter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Turner. It's an honor to be able to address you on what I believe is an important issue, and I think it's timely. Arms control agreements can be viewed as lines in the sand. The better agreements have that line as far as possible from essential elements of your national security and that of your allies. It's also important that they be effectively verifiable so that the U.S. can see if the line has been crossed, and if so, how far. This is important in order to provide time for the U.S. to detect and verify violations, seek their reversal, or to undertake action, alone or with allies, to take measures to deny the violator the benefits of his violation. When another party to an agreement crosses the line by violating the agreement, either they made a mistake, and that has happened numerous times across agreements, or they did it deliberately. One way to tell the difference is that if it was a mistake, once raised with them, you can expect them to take corrective action. In the case of the Russians throughout the history of the INF Treaty, very often, they never admitted that it was a violation, said they were sorry or did anything like that, but they changed the behavior, they changed the practice, and came back into compliance. So if a country refuses to correct a violation, then it's a safe bet that the action was deliberate. Deliberate violations are undertaken to gain unilateral advantage over the party or parties that are complying, and it provides early warning of a failure of deterrence. We all have heard that one of the purposes of verification is to deter the other party from violating the agreement and undertaking actions inconsistent with it. When you have a pattern of violations, it's a warning that deterrence writ large may be failing. When the United States draws a line in the sand and tells a country not to cross it, but then does not respond to willful, repeated crossings of that line and every other line we have drawn becomes more anemic. They're more likely to that country that's crossed the line and the other countries observing it may calculate, perhaps correctly, that they can violate the agreement, gain unilateral advantage, and will not be forced to pay any price. I'm chagrined at the failure of the Obama administration to raise Russia's violation of the INF Treaty between 2010 and 2013. The violation has been raised with Russia since 2013, but to no avail. After years of acquiescence followed by more years of diplomatic efforts to persuade Russia to eliminate the missile and come back into compliance, in my view, unilateral compliance was no longer an option. Some have argued that rather than withdraw from what has become a unilateral treaty, we should pursue the option of suspending operation of the treaty in whole or in part, indefinitely. The problem with that is that we have an example where that has been tried unsuccessfully for over a decade. Russia suspended its implementation of the Conventional Forces in Europe, or CFE treaty, in 2007. It has continued to violate it and has said that it will not resume implementation of the treaty. Over a decade. But I do not believe that withdrawal from the INF Treaty is a sufficient response to the Russian violation and circumventions of the INF Treaty. I believe that President Reagan's response to Soviet noncompliance offers lessons. First, he reported all cases of possible, probable, and certain violations to Congress and the public. If the language of the legislation that mandates the annual noncompliance report was read by the Obama administration as meaning that only issues that are clear violations need to be reported, or that only issues that have already been raised with the other party need to be reported, then perhaps the language needs to be clarified. Without this, Congress cannot be the strong ally it needs to be on these matters, particularly early on in the process. Second, President Reagan created the Arms Control Verification Committee, or ACVC, as it was called, because we're arms controllers and we can't talk without acronyms. It was chaired by the National Security Advisor, and he did that in order to ensure ongoing high-level attention to the problem of noncompliance, to ensure that verification is given high priority before, during, and after negotiations, to ensure that assessments of compliance and verification were robust and timely, and that these matters would be integrated into U.S. policies and programs. The high level of verifiability of the START 1 and INF treaties reflected the awareness of the importance the President placed on verification and compliance. I believe President Trump should recreate the ACVC and make my successor, the Assistant Secretary for Verification and Compliance, the co-chair of that group. Third, President Reagan took action to deny the Soviet Union the benefits of their violations. He pursued forced modernization, but more importantly, he pursued missile defense. It certainly would be the easiest course of action for the Trump administration to just extend the New START treaty. But doing so would be neither sufficient to address the ballistic missile threat to the U.S. and our allies from nations such as China, Iran, and North Korea, nor, in my opinion, would extending the New START be sufficient to constrain the rapidly growing ballistic missile threat from Russia. As for new multilateral agreements to constrain the missile threat to the U.S., I wonder what possible incentive other countries might have. I found a fun quote from 2013 when then Deputy Prime Minister, now Kremlin Chief of Staff, Sergei Ivanov, explained, "When I hear our American partners say, let's reduce something else, I would like to say to them, excuse me, but what we have is relatively new. They, the U.S., have not conducted any upgrades for a long time. They still use Trident missiles." So we're also talking about the possibility of multilateral agreements with serial violators and proliferators. The probability of cheating by some or all will be significant. And if the agreement's not effectively verifiable, we are unlikely to verify the cheating until too late to take effective action. But missile defenses offer an insurance policy against further and future cheating on arms control agreements. And so then, to me, the answer is deploy as rapidly as possible an effective layered missile defense to protect the American people from the threat of nuclear attack by our enemies, disincentivize investments by our current and future foes in offensive missiles tipped by weapons of mass destruction. And it is also true that deployment of a robust, expandable, layered missile defense could make future strategic and theater missile agreements, including multilateral ones, more viable as an effective tool in America's toolkit. I believe that this is a road that our country can take, and this committee can play a central role in facilitating that path. Thank you.
I thank the witnesses for their testimony. In view of the upcoming votes, probably within the next 15 minutes, we'll probably reconvene the hearing after votes, but I would like to get in as many questions and questioners as possible prior to that. So I will limit myself to one question initially. I would like to follow up with Ambassador Verschbal about his suggestion that we separate conventional from nuclear warheads in our consideration of salvaging what's left of the INF Treaty. so that we could at least protect our European friends from nuclear threats. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. It's not necessarily an easy solution. I think, as Paula can explain probably with more authority, when we signed the INF Treaty, we followed the looks-alike, counts-alike rule, because it is difficult to distinguish between versions of missiles, one with the nuclear and one with a conventional warhead. But I think we've gained a lot of experience, both with the INF Treaty itself and with the New START Treaty, in terms of very intrusive inspections. So if there were political will on the Russians' part to cooperate, I think we could have sufficient confidence that Russia honored an obligation only to deploy conventionally armed versions of this 9M729 and any future INF systems that they have in the pipeline. So it would, I think, avoid the kind of nuclear instability questions about the reliability of the U.S. guarantee. We would avoid sort of getting into scenarios where the Russians would use nuclear-armed INF systems as part of their escalate to de-escalate strategy, and limit the competition to conventionally armed systems, which may be sufficient to achieve most military tasks that we have in mind. I think that's why the administration has made clear it's not looking at nuclear options at this time as countermeasures to the Russian system. So it could make a virtue or necessity of virtue or virtue of necessity. I'm not sure which it would be. Thank you.
Thank you. The ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a series of questions that all go together, so they're kind of bunched and of one theme. Senator Lugar, you had said that one of the most important aspects of arms control treaties is their verification provisions, and I agree with you. I do want to point out that our understanding of the INF treaty violations by Russia were not necessarily disclosed under the verification process of the INF Treaty. But I have a question for you that goes to what Secretary General Rasmussen just testified about before the Intelligence Committee this morning, and you have knowledge of this. And that is that the United States had knowledge that the INF Treaty was being violated by Russia for a period of time. And as Ms. D. Sutter was indicating, that some of this information wasn't even shared with the Senate, but some of it was not shared with our allies. Former Secretary General Rasmussen of NATO indicated that there is a gap between the U.S. sharing this type of information with our allies, and certainly that's one of our trust issues. Senator Lugar, do you share a similar concern about, as we get information of violations in Russian activities, of our lack of perhaps speed or boldness in sharing that information with our allies?
Yes, I do share that problem very much. I indicated, as a matter of fact, that in this entire discussion right now, by getting out of the INF Treaty, once again, in a way, we undercut some of our leadership responsibilities with regard to our NATO allies in particular, and European allies generally. This is not the first occasion of that sort during this administration, and it's a serious difficulty because we really need to be moving the other way. We need to be indicating our leadership with regard to NATO, with regard to our European alliances, and a good way of attempting to fortify that, or maybe even to change the attitude now, is to think through precisely what you've suggested, that we make known when violations occur, or the very best of our intelligence about this situation. Because clearly, one of the reasons why we have entered the INF Treaty was to stop development of weapons that could cause grave destruction in Europe. And so we really need to do the other part of the project, and that is to gain great support among European defense officials and those involved in intelligence, and particularly in missile technology, about new information that we receive.
Thank you. Sandy, As you know, I have a high regard for both your career and your contribution to, international security and certainly our country's security. In your opening statement, you reference your work in the late 70s on the INF Treaty and, of course, its establishment in 1987 as a significant milestone. When the treaty was signed in 1987, did Russia possess weapons at that time that would have been in violation of the treaty that required them to destroy or dismantle weapons? It wasn't just a restriction on future capabilities, right? Wasn't it a restriction on capabilities that they possessed?
Yes, Congressman, absolutely. They still had in their arsenal the SS-20 as well as earlier generation intermediate range ballistic missiles, SS-4s and SS-5s, I think they were. And also some shorter range systems which were also subject to the treaty, because going down to the 500-kilometer range threshold that captured, I think, some other existing systems. So it was that's why the treaty was such a significant event. It led to the destruction of several different categories of missiles.
And Sandy, they could do that now, right? I mean, since we've known since 2010 of the violations, we've made it them aware of our assertion of the violations since 2013, and this administration, prior to beginning the process of withdrawing, gave Russia notice and said, we want you to come into compliance with the treaty. They could do that now, right? They could destroy the weapons that are not in compliance so that they could come into compliance.
Yes, that's correct. The administration has had several meetings with the Russians where they've reaffirmed the judgment that this missile is unequivocally in violation of the treaty based on the evidence we have of observing its flight tests. It's not just extrapolation. We've seen it fly to ranges in excess of the INF limit. And that the only way to restore compliance, restore the integrity of the treaty would be to dismantle and destroy all such missiles that have been produced, and I think they have 100 at least fielded. There may be more in production.
And this violation is not just an element of the treaty or a minor provision. It goes to the core of the treaty itself, does it not?
Indeed, it does, and I think that's why, in legal terms, we're using the very strong term material breach. It goes to the essence of what the treaty was.
And since you can't have a treaty of one, it's why the NAC at NATO and certainly at the NATO summit, both the NAC and the world leaders in the NATO summit made very strong statements identifying that Russia was in violation of the INF Treaty. Would you agree with that?
Yes, going back to several of the ministerial meetings last year, I think also at the summit in Brussels, the communique made a very strong statement about the treaty violation. Although allies, coming back to this issue of intelligence sharing, allies only this year kind of accepted very conclusive, unequivocal language because the U.S. finally showed them more of the sensitive details underpinning our assessment than had been done either in the first year and a half of the Trump administration or during the Obama administration. And this is partly an intelligence community issue about not compromising sources and methods, but I think in this case, it got in the way of an allied consensus.
Great. And then my final question. Many people state that our allies are very concerned about the U.S. withdrawal, but I know that you're aware, because we were just in the same hearing together, that former Secretary General Rasmussen of NATO said that he supports the decision of the United States to withdraw. At the Munich Security Conference, Chancellor Merkel made the statement that she supports the United States withdrawal, not just that she supports that there was the U.S. determination that there was an INF violation, which they were slow to come to, but supports the withdrawal, and in fact went the next step, which I thought was extraordinary, calling on Russia and China to join with the United States to initiate a new phase of INF. And in fact, I believe, I was just at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and many members of the NAC, but certainly Secretary General Stoltenberg made similar comments of that this now represented an opportunity for Russia, the United States, and China to all come together. So you are aware that some very significant allies of the United States have made statements in support of our withdrawal.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's absolutely true, and I think the administration did a good job after perhaps a few false steps at the beginning in how this decision was rolled out. But they did a good job in consulting with allies and step-by-step building a strong consensus, which you heard at the Munich Security Conference.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sutter, I'd like to begin with you. You note in your prepared testimony that Rose Gottmuller, your successor at the State Department, was responsible for producing a compliance report by law every year. Is that correct?
Yes,
So was the department also legally obligated to doing the same during your time as Assistant Secretary from 2002 to 2009?
yes.
And do you happen to know how many times the Obama administration delivered a compliance report to Congress?
Mr. Moulton, I will be the first one to say that my successor did a far, far better job than I did at getting out the annual reports. I will also note, some of you may remember that the intelligence community was in the process during some of that time of reevaluating how they were going to write intelligence reports and footnotes. And the biggest mistake I made is that for years I was the one that held the pen on the non-compliance report. And I was afraid as Assistant Secretary that if I got too involved with it, I would get swept back up and consumed by it. It's one of the big mistakes I made as Assistant Secretary. So they were far more significant. We had a report, we just couldn't get it put to bed. And it was massive and very thorough.
I appreciate your candor. Thank you. Senator Lugar, in your testimony, you specifically mentioned the importance of leverage and verification in arms control. How can the U.S. best develop leverage to get to and to negotiate an INF replacement? What does follow-on verification look like?
Well, in addition to the comments that have been made about a better cohesion with our European allies, it seems to me we need to be thinking more about missile defense and about really the ways in which we negate the value of these missiles or the warheads or what have you. This is a very complex and controversial subject all by itself, but at the same time, in response to your question, it is a way at least of moving the subject along in terms of negotiation, and likewise in terms of safety for the parties that are involved.
May I ask the Ambassador, at an event in Washington on December 14th, Senator Tom Cotton said that the Pentagon should rapidly develop new intermediate-range missiles despite uncertainty about where they could be fielded. Quote, basing questions can obviously be controversial, but that will be a decision to be made for the future. To your knowledge, have any countries in Europe agreed to host U.S. ground-launched intermediate-range systems within their border?
None have agreed to host them because they haven't been asked. This is still a hypothetical possibility depending on how the review of the different options unfolds inside NATO. But the administration has not asked anyone to host these missiles either in Europe or in Northeast Asia.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, do you sincerely believe that NATO supports, quote, fully withdrawing from the treaty? Many foreign ministers and key NATO leaders have previously made public statements urging the U.S. not to withdraw. How do you square that with what we've heard today?
Well, I think different allies have slightly different nuances in their position. I think they all have come around to the conclusion that the Russians are in material breach and that there's a justification for withdrawing and that there's really no alternative. But I think many of them are emphasizing the need to make the last-ditch effort before the treaty literally goes out of business on August the 2nd to see if there's a way of rescuing the treaty through arms control. And if not, many have also spoken of some kind of successor agreement to keep some form of constraint on this category of systems if we can't save the INF Treaty itself.
Senator Lugar, back to you. A successor agreement like the Ambassador states is something that many of us would like to see if the INF Treaty goes away. Many of us would also like to see it expand into the Asia-Pacific region. Walk us through how that might occur, how we might build an INF Treaty to encompass the threat from China.
Well, first of all, I suspect that we would make that point to the Russians we would indicate literally that this isn't the end of the story, and that even if the INF Treaty finally falls by the wayside, something else is going to follow that is more comprehensive and of greater safety to more countries.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Has expired. Mr. Wilson, you just have a
Thank-
few minutes here before we have to go.
Yes,
to
and
the
thank you, Chairman Jim Cooper. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here, but particularly Senator Lugar. You have benefited my constituents. The family of Chip Andre, your former chief of staff, Taylor Andre, you inspired to become the legislative director in our office. He was trained also by Senator Lindsey Graham, and now he's the chief of staff to Congressman Mike Gallagher, but because of your inspiration. So thank you very much. And indeed, Mr. Sutter, in your written statement, and you stated, the United States draws a line in the sand and tells the country not to cross it, but does not respond with repeated willful crossing. That line and every other line time we will have drawn will become anemic. Russia has repeatedly and willfully violated the treaty, and it's irrational that we remain the only actor in compliance. With that, the question, I am particularly concerned about the constraints of the INF Treaty on our ability to execute the national defense strategy with regard to great powers competition. We must be able to counter strategic threats from our two competitors, Russia and China. How is China exploiting our compliance in order to advance their missile arsenal, threatening the interest of the Indo-Pacific region?
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. One of the things about how the United States conducts itself with regard to arms control is that not only would the U.S. never, by law and by process, intentionally violate an arms control obligation, moreover, the process is designed to make sure that we never even get close to that line. And so it's not just that the treaty would prohibit certain things, but more that it tells the Pentagon, don't go in that direction.
Thank you very much. And also, with Russia violating the treaty, and as pointed out by Congressman Turner, NATO has supported withdrawal. What is the advantage of remaining in an unenforced treaty? Won't the withdrawal demonstrate peace through strength in that it would incentivize Moscow to return to the negotiating table while enabling the United States to better protect our allies and national security interest?
Yes, I believe that the withdrawal, and I must say that I don't recall a violation where there has been such widespread consensus that it was not only a violation but a material breach. But the withdrawal, since we've been unable since 2013 to get them to come back into compliance, and it's very similar, disturbingly, to the situation with the CFE treaty, continued compliance by the United States, they would believe that we won't really do it. We won't really get out. And they will be able to continue to have us constrained and no one else. So while they wanted out of the treaty for a long time, it was only after the United States indicated we might get out that they suddenly thought the INF Treaty was a good thing that they wanted. It's not only important for Russia, but it's important for every other country that we might be concerned about, because they watch. These countries watch what happens. And if they see Russia continue to get away with this, especially since it's been public since 2013 and 14, they will believe that the United States does not take compliance seriously and is not willing to belly up to the bar to pay the price to either bring them back into compliance or to respond to deny them the benefits.
And we've seen the consequence of not following a red line. And so thank you for raising that. How does withdrawal from the INF Treaty impact Russia's ability to acquire new systems and technological or strategic advances with intermediate range missiles? Would Russia have acquired similar systems and weapons in continued direct violation of the treaty if the U.S. had not withdrawn?
I believe that they've undertaken some effort to try to muddy the waters about whether or not it was a violation. And certainly in preparation for this hearing, I've been pretty amazed at how many programs they have where, for example, they use the Iskander launcher for many different systems that are very confusing. And one other thing that I would mention is we did have experience with the issue of nuclear versus non-nuclear warheads with the SS-23 missiles. And so your staff can go back and look at that. But we had no idea that Russia had given to the Czech Republic, Eastern Germany, and Poland SS-23 missiles. Originally, they said that they were just conventional warheads. We did find conventional warheads, but then we found that they had also been given the connecting sections to deploy a nuclear warhead. Russia obviously would, the Soviet Union certainly never would have given command and control of the nuclear warheads to their allies because they liked them even less than they liked us, but they would have come in and taken control. It's very difficult to do, and the verification commission that's part of the INF Treaty would have to be very deliberate in trying to make new agreements in order to figure out how to implement any subsequent limitations.
Thank you very much. My time is up.
The subcommittee will stand in recess. We'll return, and we'll take at least 20 minutes, but immediately after the last vote, we will be back. Thanks.
Here we are. Yeah, that's what I was trying to think of.
subcommittee will come to order. I apologize, I thought it was 2 votes. It turned out to be 4 votes. Took a little longer than we thought. Until other members come, I was going to ask a few questions. We haven't focused as much on New Start as we probably need to. And it seems like the options are either to extend it, to renegotiate it, to not extend it, and one of the witnesses even suggested returning to the sort agreement previous. So, Senator Lugar, I'd like to start with you and ask what you think it would take to successfully negotiate either an extension or an improvement on the New START agreement.
I believe that the verification provisions of New START are important to begin with, leaving aside anything else. It seems to me to be really a safety net there. But I think I go back in my own memories to the debate on New START to begin with. It was quite a debate within the Republican Party at that time. Senator McConnell, our leader, and John Kyle, particularly outspoken, were not in favor, really, of reducing the number of warheads and missiles and whatever that are involved in New START. We've been moving from the time of Lugar all the way down to roughly 10,000 warheads. There's New START's 1,550 as it wound up. There were some in not only the Congress but the administration who felt it was time to rebuild some of our armament, not to be reducing the number of weapons. Now, fortunately, a 2/3 majority was finally found, but not easily. I remember vividly that the vote on New START occurred after Christmas in that year of 2010 over the protests of many members wanting not to come back for something of that variety. And 2 or 3 days before the end of the year, a 2/3 majority was found with a good number of Republicans voting against it. That I mentioned because subsequent to New START, there's not really been any movement in the Senate that I can recall for reduction of the 1,550 to a lower total, quite apart from many other elements of the New START situation. I think in terms of the safety of the world, it would be a good idea to consider that, but it's not been on the table for 9 years. No one really has made any initiative in the administrations or in the Senate. So we have left at least those limits and the verification aspect of it that may back up some other arms control agreements that could occur that we've been discussing earlier in a hearing. But it's important to be renewed, to absent and leave the INF Treaty and then to leave New START altogether really calls for a total new beginning, and right now I don't see that kind of initiative in the administration or the Congress. So we had at best hold on to what we have there. It at least offers at least some, not necessarily a safety net, but at least some provisions that are helpful, it seems to me, in terms of safety.
The press has reported that the president is interested in perhaps winning a Nobel Prize for his work with North Korea. Perhaps he could be persuaded to win a Nobel Prize by reducing nuclear weapons, because I think, as Churchill said, we already have enough to make the rubble bounce, and perhaps 1,000 would be sufficient, or another number like that, if other countries could also be persuaded to reduce theirs. Ambassador Withdrawal, would you say that we should extend, renew, improve, terminate the New START agreement?
I favor extending it, which isn't mutually exclusive from also seeking over the longer term to improve it. But I think the treaty itself allows for a straight extension for up to 5 years. It could be extended for a shorter period if there was an effort to already begin work on a follow-on agreement. I would worry that they were trying to get a whole new agreement in the time remaining before the expiration of New START might be insufficient. But I think the agreement, as it stands, even with the current ceilings, is a contribution to stability and predictability. And as important as the limits in the agreement are the verification and transparency requirements, which I know our military is very attached to because it gives them far more understanding of Russian strategic forces and where they're going, enables them to avoid worst-case assessments of the Russian programs. So I think it would be in our interest to extend it. If we think that there's some new technologies that need to be factored into the treaty that aren't covered, I mean, the treaty has some provisions allowing for discussion and amendment of the treaty to do that. The INF issue, if it can't be resolved in any standalone agreement, could conceivably be addressed in a follow-on agreement. But I would start by extending it, building a little more cushion of time to consider any additional constraints. Paula de Sutter mentioned missile defense. There's no contradiction between continuing to develop and deploy missile defense systems while maintaining the New START agreement. I think there's still questions about our ability to effectively counter the sophisticated Russian strategic forces, which are getting even more sophisticated with these hypersonic glide vehicles and other things. But missile defense does have a place in our overall deterrence strategy, and it can be done while we maintain a New START.
My final question is whether the State Department today is even staffed adequately to negotiate some of these new agreements, because it's our impression that several executive agencies are short-staffed. Do either of you happen to know?
Mr. Cooper, my impression is that the Verification Bureau not only had to take on responsibility for some arms control negotiations, but I think that they are losing staff, and I think that they're going to need. It can be a very technical issue, and so when the State Department came and said, Paula, you have to do a diversity report, I'm like, what? And they said, how many people, what color and background? And I said, okay, I have 4 different kind of nuclear people, nuclear engineers, nuclear chemists, I have 3 different kinds of chemists to do. It's very diverse and it's very technical, and they are going to need to be bulked up in a way I think that they have not been.
Thank you. Mr. Carbajal?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to all the witnesses here. First there was the withdrawal of the JCPOA and now the INF. Obviously, the message and the trend that we are establishing go towards what I feel is damaging and destabilizing. These agreements, these treaties, go beyond their objectives to prevent development and proliferation of lethal weapons. And more importantly, they continue a framework of communication and access to information that we otherwise would not have. And I'm concerned that without those treaties in place, we are at a major disadvantage and going backwards instead of forward in reducing proliferation. This administration and some former officials have stated that China is not limited by the INF Treaty and that U.S. withdrawal would benefit U.S. military planning in the Pacific. I have 4 questions, but I'm going to ask 2 of them at a time to not overwhelm you. The first question, does the INF prevent the United States from meeting its military requirements against China? And 2, do you believe it is militarily necessary for the United States to deploy INF weapons in the Pacific region? To any and all of you.
I'll go first. First of all, I agree with you, Congressman, that the erosion of all the different agreements and constraints on arms competition and on proliferation is worrisome, particularly when we're dealing with a far more aggressive Russia and a more aggressive China as well. But on the specific questions, there are already existing systems in our arsenal or in development that can meet the requirements in the Asia-Pacific region. But there may be an advantage to having ground-launched systems in addition to the existing air-launched and sea-launched systems, just because our naval vessels have multiple missions, and it's hard to do all the roles on one platform. But we can target military targets deep inside Chinese territory today, and we can deal with the Chinese Navy. But INF range missiles over time, as Chinese capabilities improve, could enhance our ability to do these kinds of deep strike or anti-ship missions. So we can do it now, but we might be able to do it better with INF. But it's a choice whether this is the place to spend our money or not. And as I said in my statement, whether we would have an easy time convincing allies to host these systems on their territory, in particular Japan and Korea, which would be the logical place, is, in my view, doubtful. We saw tremendous controversy when we put the THAAD ballistic missile defense systems in Korea, which are defensive systems. The Chinese freaked out and even imposed sanctions on Korea, and so I think they will be a bit wary of going through that again. We can put them in Guam, but it's not the ideal location to deploy such systems. So that's how I would respond to your question.
Well, I'd like to say that for me, and I'm not a Pentagon planner, I'm not in the region making decisions about this, and so there may be offensive-related upgrades that need to be done. I don't know. But for me, the answer to an offensive buildup of the kind that China has pursued, which I must say, when all of this issue came up and I was having to speak about it, I did some research into what kind of ballistic missile deployments is China pursuing, and I was amazed. I cannot see how we could counter with offense the Chinese buildup, and I don't think that's the way to go. I think the way to go is defense. And I think that had we had 10 years ago the kind of ballistic missile defense capabilities President Reagan envisioned, we wouldn't be seeing that kind of buildup in China. What we need to do is deploy the missile defense so that they will see that they have wasted their money, they and the Russians.
I see I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Keating?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had a question for Senator Lugar. In your testimony, you made it clear that Russia was in violation of the INF Treaty. It's a belief I have. I think most of us have. It's a belief our NATO allies have had. I was there last week in Brussels, and they joined on with that statement. However, they had a strong feeling, at least in the discussions I was involved with, that they wanted to use the 6-month period to re-engage Russia into serious discussions about trying to revive the treaty or aspects of that treaty. And could you just share with some of your experience dealing with other presidents? Because violations of treaties are not, it's not a new phenomenon. It happens. But you've had some experience. Can you share with us some possible inroads or techniques that could be employed that you've seen other presidents try to use to try and revive some of these discussions? The way I think we're going to get great support if we begin doing that with our European allies as well.
First of all, I would comment that the president has to want to get back into the discussions. At this point, there is not evidence that that's the case, but leaving aside his current attitude, I think some of the allies, and if you've met with them recently, you would be well informed, really are very hopeful for United States leadership in this area, for some vision, for some prospects of hope, as opposed to simply indicating that we're going to go to the end of the line and that's it, and there's really nothing out there. There's really a desire for something to be out there. So ideally, there would be members of the administration, maybe even members of Congress, who would pick up the ball at this point and say, it's time to get a hold of some Russians. What's occurring in the press is President Putin is making all sorts of threats. He gave at least some type of press release the other day that listed specific targets in the United States that he found attractive to think about. Well, this is a serious business. It really does require right now, at the highest levels, that we get back in touch with the Russians and discuss what's going on. It seems to me it's just been convenient for the administration to say, after all, these violations have been going on now for several years, and it's simply time to wind that particular one up. While at the same time, Putin is coming back and saying that he's really prepared to really sock it to him. And we better take that seriously. We really need to engage the Russians right now and reassure our European allies that we're prepared to do that. And maybe even enlist some of them to be a part of that situation.
Yeah, I agree with you in your belief that there's no indication that I received last week that we're taking this period and using it to try and revive talks or gain further commitments, which is disappointing, but it's also disappointing to our allies.
Yes.
And there's something you touched upon briefly that I think is worth emphasizing, and that's the fact that even our attempt to do so would continue to put us in a greater mantle of leadership on these, rather than being seen, even though they're the violators, even the perception that we're the ones retreating from this. And also, I was really struck with some of the real fissures that are there with our allies right now. And to me, there's a positive benefit in, for no other reason, showing them that we want to work along lines that they so strongly feel as their allies, even if it's not successful. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, we've already been through a period in which the president attacked NATO in a way by saying the allies have got to pay their fair share, that they're not meeting their obligations, and almost implying that this is not America's role to defend all these nations of NATO, regardless of World War II and subsequent developments. That's a very dangerous attitude to take. What we really need right now is a revival of NATO, a revival of the spirit of the allies, clarity on our part that we are prepared to be a leader, and their excitement, or at least approval of the fact that that's the case, that they want us around. They want us to be helpful in this respect. This won't help to keep condemning treaties as the worst one ever made. It really has got to be a time now in which we get together with our partners. Now, we could use this time, because of this discussion we've been having about the Inf Treaty, to say this is a good time to turn things around and begin to have these talks, begin to have this planning.
Well, thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The last question will be the ranking members.
Thank you. Senator, following on what you have said about recently we've had Putin making very aggressive statements that are also coupled with his nuclear modernization, I have a question for the ambassador. When we look at what Putin is doing in his modernization, he's developing nuclear weapon systems that are outside of the INF and New START, which he's bragging about and is obviously very destabilizing. For example, his hypersonic weapons, a nuclear-powered cruise missile, and a nuclear-powered underwater drone called Poseidon, which apparently are outside of the New START. How do you believe we should respond to the fact that obviously there's significant proliferation, significant increase that's occurring to the United States with these weapons, these types of weapons, and instability as we approach the renewal of New START?
Thank you, Congressman. Putin certainly has been making a lot of aggressive statements lately, and he seems quite excited by all these new technologies and wonder weapons that his scientists are producing. I think most of the other scientists in Russia are emigrating, but at least in the military, they're going strong. But I think we'll have to, first of all, assess whether these new systems, if they do get deployed, whether they are covered or not. I think the hypersonic weapons may be delivered by ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, in which case we should try to insist that they're covered and subject to numerical limits, although that still doesn't address the potential qualitative edge that the Russians may gain. The nuclear cruise missile, if that one I'm skeptical ever will be fielded, to have a nuclear reactor on each missile so it can fly endlessly around the world. But the range clearly would be intercontinental, so presumably that would count as well. And this Poseidon underwater drone that surfaces off the coast and devastates everything within hundreds of miles, that one does defy categorization. So we do have to potentially look to expand the coverage of the New START treaty. That doesn't mean we shouldn't extend it on its own terms, at least as a short-term stabilization measure, but we're clearly going to have to figure out ways to address these new technologies and others that may emerge in the coming years. The traditional paradigm for arms control goes back to the 70s. Clearly, we'll have to find ways to incorporate restrictions and verification measures that work for new technologies if arms control is to remain viable. But I think it's worth pursuing that. Even with the Russian violation of the INF Treaty, it's in our interest to kind of limit their ability to deploy and to gain the transparency about their new technologies so that we're not kind of caught by surprise in the coming years.
That concludes the questioning. I would like to thank the witnesses for their expertise, for their testimony, and for their patience. The hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.